Hi everyone, and welcome to the video presentation for module number 21. In this module we're going to talk about our next species of counterpoint called second species counterpoint. The objectives for this module are to define the term second species counterpoint, to understand the rules for second species counterpoint, and to be able to write second species counterpoint. So let's talk about second species counterpoint. First of all, in second species counterpoint, the line of counterpoint you compose is twice as fast as the cantus firmus. You can use consonant or dissonant harmonies in this species. So before, with first species counterpoint, we could only use consonant harmonies. But now, since the rhythm scheme is different, we can sometimes use dissonant harmonies. So here's an example of second species counterpoint. You can see that for every whole note in the cantus firmus, a half note is written in the counterpoint. This creates a repeating pattern of strong beats and weak beats. So at the beginning of each measure, and usually when you have two notes at the same time, we have a strong beat. So that first note in the cantus firmus, where we have the half note rest in the counterpoint, is a strong beat. Then the second beat in that measure is a weak beat. This measure, where we have a C in the cantus firmus and an E in the counterpoint, that is a strong beat. Then we have a weak beat, where we have a note by itself. And that pattern continues throughout the entire second species counterpoint example. So we always have this meter, this repeating beat, or repeating pattern of strong beats and weak beats. Now, because some notes are on weak beats and other notes are on strong beats, it's now possible to use dissonances in the counterpoint. So if you look at this example, you'll see that we have a fourth, which is a dissonant harmony, on the weak beat of the second measure. And we can use it there because that beat is not emphasized. It's not a strong beat. So we have an opportunity to use a dissonance. And then over here, we have a seventh in that measure, and you can see that that is also on a weak beat. So dissonances can be used as long as they are always on weak beats of the measure. So let's do a little bit of a reminder of harmony and which harmonies are consonant and which ones are dissonant. So all the consonant harmonies are the octave, the sixth, the fifth, the third, and the unison. Those are all the consonant harmonies, the ones that sound stable. And the harmonies that are dissonant, the ones that are harsh sounding and need to resolve to a consonance, the ones that are unstable, those are the seventh, the diminished fifth, the augmented fourth, the perfect fourth, and the second. And so when we're talking about the dissonances, we're talking about using these on those weak beats of the measure. All right, so let's talk about the rules for harmony and rhythm in second species counterpoint. So first of all, the first measure will always have a half rest and then a half note that is a consonance. So you can see our first measure here has an A in the cantus firmus and a half note rest in the counterpoint. And then the first note we hear is a consonant octave, another A. Now, since that's the first note, it can be an octave, or it can be a fifth, or it can be a unison. But it will be one of those three, a consonance. Now, the strong beats must always have a consonance. So since those beats are the strong ones, the emphasized ones, we want to make sure that all of those beats are stable. Okay? So all the strong beats, all the first notes in the measure, must always have a consonance. But on the weak beats, on the second beat of the measure, the second note of the measure, the interval can be a consonance, or for the first time ever, it can be a dissonance. And that's because since that beat is already unstable, it can sound okay if it has an unstable harmony itself, if it has a dissonance on it. That doesn't mean it has to, but we have the option of doing that. Unisons, since again we have weak beats to work with, unisons aren't as striking on a weak beat, so we can use unisons anywhere in the counterpoint, not just the beginning and not just the end. We can use them anywhere we want as long as it's on a weak beat. So they can go on the second beat, the second note of the measures if we need them to. And then all the other rules about harmony apply, such as the cadence must be an octave or a unison. The first note must have an octave, a fifth, or a unison, and all the other rules as well. So, but the big ones are that strong beats must always have consonants, and weak beats can be either a consonance or a dissonance. So second species in this way teaches you how to introduce dissonances and what to do with them once they are introduced into the counterpoint. So let's talk about that. So creating and resolving dissonances in second species. One of the most important things that's taught in music theory is how dissonances are handled in the style of music we're studying, which is, this classical style, basically. A dissonance must always be created correctly and then resolved correctly. So you're always creating a dissonance, you're always making something unstable by creating it in the right way, and then you're always resolving that dissonance in the correct way as well. So dissonances, since they are unstable and they're harsh, they must be treated in the right way, which means they must be created correctly and resolved correctly. Okay? A dissonance must be created by a step in the second species counterpoint, and that step will always be from a consonance. And then once you've created that dissonance, it must be resolved by a step, which will be to another consonance in this species. So a dissonance must be created by a step, and then once it's created, it must be resolved by a step to another consonance. And you can see this in the second measure here. We have a consonance from the C to the E of a third, and then we create a dissonance by moving the E in the counterpoint up to an F. So we're creating a dissonance from what was a third by moving up a step to a fourth. So we've created the dissonance by a step. And once we have that dissonance, that unstable sound, we have to resolve it to a consonance. And we do that by going up by step to what becomes a sixth when both the voices move. So we have consonants, creating a dissonance by step, and then resolving to a consonance by step. There's another example here in the other direction. So this measure starts with an octave D, a consonance. Then we create a seventh by stepping down, and then that resolves down by step to become a fifth, another consonance. So we have octave, dissonance, and then consonance fifth. Okay, all by step. So just remember, since we're just learning about dissonances, we always want to approach them, create them by step, and then resolve them by step. And they will always be from one consonance to another consonance. All right, so this is all to say, the one thing you can't do is leap to a dissonance because it's just too unstable to leap to a dissonance. Dissonances must always be created by a step and resolved by a step. All right, so let's talk about relative motion rules that are slightly different in second species. So the first thing to remember is that all the previous rules apply. So you cannot have things like parallel unisons, parallel fifths, or octaves. They'll just look a little bit different in second species. So here, this is an example of something not to do. You have a sixth between the D and the B, moving to a fifth, and then both those voices, since the D is sustained throughout the measure, the D and the A are sounded together, and they both move down to the C and the G, which creates parallel fifths. So you cannot do that in second species. Right? So that is parallel fifths, a forbidden thing, a mistake in second species counterpoint. Also, since the rhythms are faster, we no longer can have repeated notes in this species, because then your note values would become whole notes, which would be, first species. So we don't want first species. So you're not allowed to repeat any notes. So no oblique motion in this species. And the cadence should always have contrary motion by step, like before. And then we want to avoid accented parallel octaves, but accented parallel fifths are okay. So I have two examples here. The first is an example of accented parallel octaves. And accented just means that we have either an octave or a unison on successive strong beats of two measures. So in the first measure, in that middle example, we have an octave on the strong beat, and then we have a note in between of a tenth, but then we have another octave on another strong beat. So that's considered not parallel octaves exactly, but accented parallel octaves, which is not allowed. So you can see, since there are such strong intervals and they're both on a strong beat, you can still kind of hear them as parallel octaves. We call those accented parallel octaves, and they are not allowed. And the same thing goes for unisons too. However, accented fifths are okay. So in the last example there, which I've written the text in green, we have a fifth on the strong beat of a measure, and then another fifth on the strong beat of the measure after that. And so that is what's called accented fifths, and those are actually okay. So that's a little bit less of a strong consonant, so that's why that's allowed there. And then the final thing, which is a little bit hard to remember, and not everybody agrees on this, but across a bar line, leaps larger than a perfect fourth are not allowed. So since we're moving, in that case, we'd be moving from a weak beat and doing something that is sort of unstabilizing, such as leaping, it creates kind of this weird thing where we're landing on, something that's dramatic on a very strong beat. So it sticks out a little bit too much for what's considered acceptable in this style. So it's best, in most people's opinion, to avoid leaps larger than a perfect fourth that cross a bar line, so that go from a weak beat to a strong beat. So that's just something to think about and in most cases avoid. So let's look at an example of writing second species counterpoint. Now this is a Canis Firmus. That's actually the same one we had before, but this time we're going to write a second species example above this Canis Firmus. Now we'll follow all the rules for second species, which means we'll be writing all half notes. We'll follow the same procedures like we did before, which is to make a plan. So planning the shape, the high point, location, and the cadence. All the same procedures apply. Then we'll choose the high point note, and then we'll choose the first note. And then we'll compose the rest according to our shape and the cadence and all the decisions that come with that. So let's go ahead and get started. And so I'll remind you what this Canis Firmus sounds like first. Okay, so a second species counterpoint always starts with a half rest. So let's go ahead and just write that in there, even though we're not going to start there. But let's go ahead and just write in that half rest to remind ourselves. Okay. Now we want to plan the shape, the high point, location, and the cadence. Let's go to the cadence. So again, we don't really have a lot of choices here. We need to make sure that our last note is a octave or a unison. And now unison won't work because our Canis Firmus is moving in the downward direction, and there's no note that we can write that can go in the upwards direction that exists that won't cross below the Canis Firmus. So we can't use that low G again. We could use the upper G octave there. Now the higher G is the tonic note, but then that would be 2 octaves above, and remember we can't have anything larger than a tenth when we're writing these counterpoints. So the only option we have is to end on that G on the second line from the bottom. Now this is going to be the key of G minor because there's 2 flats. So we need to approach our cadence by contrary motion by step, just like before. So that means that the only note we can use to get to that G is going to be an F. But since this is G minor, it can't just be an F natural, it has to be an F sharp. Okay? And so that's our cadence. Okay, so that's going to be a 6, and I'll write that down here, to an octave here. All right, great. So now we have our cadence. We should choose our high point location. Now you want it to be in a different place than our Canis Verbis high point, which has its high point here. So maybe our second species counterpoint line high point can be maybe in this measure. So plan on having our high point here. Now, we could go ahead and maybe make some suggestions of what our high point could be. So we could have a high point of this note A, right? Because that would harmonize as an octave with that A. We could maybe have a B flat, but that won't work because B flat is a second with that A. Although now that we can have seconds, right, we can have dissonances, we actually could maybe have our high point here in the second part of the measure. So we could write that in as a possibility. And then we could also have a C, which would be a tenth above that A, which is about as high as we can go. So that would be the highest note that we could write as our high point. So let's just kind of leave those in there and see which ones we get to. All right, now we want to plan our shape. And as always, we want to create as much contrary motion as possible. So we're going to start by going in the downward direction. And then at some point, we will have to move in the upwards direction. Again, this is just a rough guideline, right? So the upwards direction to the high point measure there. Then we'll have to make a steep little turn so we can get low enough to get to our cadence in contrary motion, which will lead us back up like that. So we have a shape that reflects contrary motion as much as we can, which will just kind of serve as a guideline of what direction we can go with our notes, and will lead us up to the high point there in that measure. All right, so we did step 1, shape, high point location, and cadence. So we could choose our high point and first note. Let's start with the first note. And so our options include starting on a fifth. Well, starting on a unison, I guess, is one option. So unison would be this G. That's probably not a good choice because if we want to go in the downward direction, again, we'd have to go down to an F or something like that, which is way below our C. So G is not a good, that low G is not a good choice for this. We could start on a fifth, which would be the note D. And that actually might work. So we could have 5 here. Now, if, of course, we want to go down, so if we chose that as our high point and we wanted to go down, the only note we could really move to is this note C. And that's a unison, which is allowed in second species, but that unison is on a strong beat, beat number 1 of the measure. So if we wanted to move in the downward direction and start on that D, that's probably going to be pretty much impossible. So we can't use a fifth either. That's not a good idea. So why don't we use the note G, which is an octave above our starting note, G. So that's probably the only starting note we can really start with. So, you know, I'm giving you all these suggestions because these are the ways you should be thinking when you're composing these things on your own. I know it feels like I'm kind of talking a lot and making a lot of mistakes, but it's just to show you like the process of how someone should think about writing these things, okay? To kind of, you know, you have to always use logic to kind of make your way through these examples. So we let's start on that note G there as an octave, okay? Now we want to, it says pick a high point, and you know, we could, since we're trying to get to a note that's above that G and that G as a high point, we could do some elimination and maybe eliminate that A there. So we could go to the C or we could go to the B flat. And instead of choosing a high point, why don't we just kind of leave those two there and see what the best choice is by the time we get there. Okay, so we're kind of done with step 2. We're going to maybe decide on our high point a little bit later, but we have some possibilities for a high point. So compose the rest according to the shape that we're given. So we want to start by going in the downward direction. Now, if we just step down, like most melodies should step, we would end up on an F, which is a fourth, and dissonances are allowed in this species, but a fourth cannot be on a strong beat, right? A dissonance cannot be on a strong beat, so we can't use that F as the first note in that measure. So maybe we can do a small leap down to an E, which is the next choice, and that'll be a third, which is a consonance, which is great because that is now on a strong beat, which is what it should be. Okay. So we want to keep going down. We could step down to a D, which would give us a second, which is allowed in this species. Okay. So now we have a dissonance, D. And dissonances should always be created by step, so it was created by step, and then they should always resolve by step. So if we move down by step, we would end up on a C, which is another second. So that does not resolve our dissonance. We can't use that C. So maybe we could step the other way. So we still need to resolve this by step, so we could go up by step to an E flat, which is a fourth, which again is a dissonance. So we're not resolving anything by going to another dissonance. So that won't work either. So I think we've reached a point where we have decided that that D is not a good choice. But we still need to move in the downward direction. So we could maybe go down by another third. And one of the rules for first species is if you're going to have more than one leap in a row, then they should outline a triad. And you can see that this outlines a C minor triad. So that's okay. So we can do that if we want. Now this ends up on a unison, C, but that's okay because this is on a weak beat of the measure. So now that's fine. So we can use this unison if we want to. So that's great. Okay. So we've had outlining a triad on all leaps. So we probably want to step now. So we've had leap, leap, and now we need to step because we want our counterpoint to be mostly step in order to hold together. So we could step downwards, but that would create parallel unisons, right? Because we'd have C moving to a C, and then both notes move to a B flat. So that is parallel unison, so we can't do that. So even though our shape says we should keep going down, the only choice we really have now is to go up by step. So let's go up by step to a D, and that will make this a third. And now we've had a chance to go in the downward direction. Let's see if we can go in the upwards direction, which is what our shape is kind of suggesting. So let's go up to, by step, to this note, E flat, which is a fourth. So that is a dissonance on a weak beat, which is a good thing. We want to resolve that up by step if we can, or down by step to a consonance. So we could go in the upwards direction, which is what we want our shape to do. So we could go up by step to D to F, which is a third. So that's great. So we resolved our dissonance fourth up by step to F. Okay, so very nice. All right. Now we could, we're going to keep going in the upwards direction. So we could write another step up to a G, which is another fourth. So that's another dissonance. And we want to resolve that up, by step if we can. So going upwards, we'd end up on an A, which is a sixth with a C, and that is a consonant. So that's good. We had a consonant third, moved to a dissonant fourth by step, and then resolved that to a consonant sixth by a step. So we're in great shape. Okay. Now we could keep on going. So we could go to a B flat by step. Now this is going to be a seventh, which is a dissonance. So we want to resolve that by step if we can. And so that would mean we'd end up on this C. I guess you could also go down to the B, the A if you wanted to. But since we picked that as our high point, we might as well just stick with it. So we've decided that that C is going to be our high point now. And that resolves our seventh, our dissonance, by step to an octave A, which is good. Okay, so we've had leap, leap, step, 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 step. So we probably want to have some kind of leap for the purposes of making this have some kind of variety. So I'm not sure exactly what to leap to at this point. You know, some possibilities would be a small leap to an A, maybe. We could have a larger leap to an F if we wanted to. That's about it. So we could, you might think we could leap to an E flat as a sixth, but that interval would be a diminished fifth, right? Which is a dissonant interval, which we cannot leap to. So we can't use that E flat. So we could use the F or the A. And so let's kind of leave that for now and maybe pick one in a second. So let's maybe, whenever I get stuck with something, I kind of work my way backwards. So we want to get to this cadence again. So let's see what our possibilities are for this cadence. So if we want to get to this F sharp, we could, you know, some notes that might work would be like a G, but that would be a seventh, so we can't really do that. Another possibility might be to end up on a D and then leap by a third, but then that creates a fourth, so that's not really a good thing to do. And then another possibility might be to write an E, and that's stepwise motion to get to that G, and that actually looks okay. Now let's see what happens when I play that and see what that sounds like. Well, that sounded pretty weird in this style, right? So two things are happening there. We have A to E flat, which I said was a diminished fifth. So that's dissonance on a strong beat. And we also have an E flat to an F sharp, which is an augmented second interval, which we cannot have in our melodies. So one way we can fix this without picking a different note is to actually add an accidental so that we don't have an E flat anymore. Instead, we have an E natural. And that's going to create a perfect fifth with the A, which is allowed, and it eliminates that augmented second. Now this, you might be thinking, well, I thought I could only raise the leading tone, but we have another kind of minor scale, don't we? So we had harmonic minor, which only raised the leading tone, but we also have melodic minor, which raises both the sixth and the seventh degrees. And this is exactly why we have that scale. So minor, like I think I've said before, is a complete headache, and we have lots of ways to get around its problems. And one way is to raise both the sixth and seventh degree of the scale, which eliminates that diminished fifth I have between A and E, and it also eliminates the augmented second we have between E flat and F. So whenever you're ascending, you have this option of using the raised sixth in addition to the raised seventh. And so now this creates this really nice sound, which is nice and consonant and great. So let's do that. Let's use E natural there instead of E flat. And so we can get there by contrary motion as well. So if we could write a D here, and then maybe when I did this, I wrote a G here as a sixth, and then that B flat to D was a third. And so to get to that G, the thing I think that makes the most sense is to leap down to this F natural, which is a little bit of a dramatic leap, making this a sixth, and then moving to a sixth in parallel motion there. So that's probably a good way to do that. You could, now that I look at this, you could also use that A, which would be contrary motion, which kind of, gets you out of that sort of dramatic F. So I'm not sure which one I really like better. So here's the one I just wrote. And then if I made that into an F instead, let's see what that would sound like. kind of like the F natural better, so we'll keep that. And I think that's a nice little change from the series of steps we had, getting us to that high point there. All right, so let's play this, see how it turned out. All right, pretty nice little counterpoint. We followed our shape, we got to our high point, had a nice little cadence, added some leaps in there for variety, which worked out really nice. Now notice those leaps I added, right? They're never across a bar line, and then they're balanced by stepping in the opposite direction. So when I had that big leap of a fifth, I balanced it by going up by step in the opposite direction of the leap. And then when I had that smaller leap, the fourth, I balanced that by having a step in the opposite direction. So that's how you want to handle all your leaps of anything bigger than a third. Okay, well that's it. A lot of information and hopefully a good example. So we'll talk more about this in the live Zoom session. So thanks for watching and have a great day.